Speaker this afternoon, Carolyn Finney, is an assistant professor of geography in the School of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. She's conducted research in Nepal, speaking with women about their experiences collecting fuel, fodder, and water, and the challenges of balancing traditional gender roles with immediate economic needs. And in the United States, she has explored how these same issues influence African Americans' participation in environmental debate and decision-making. What happens, she asks, when the environmental debate presumes to encompass most perspectives, expectations, and needs? So the aim of her work has been to develop greater cultural competency within environmental organizations and institutions, to challenge media outlets on the representation or misrepresentation of different folks, and increase awareness of how privilege shapes who gets to speak to environmental issues and determine policy and action. There's a lovely trio of YouTube videos, an interview conducted by one of Carolyn's students, in which she talks about her family background and her intellectual grounding. She grew up in a very wealthy suburb of New York, where her father worked as a caretaker for a wealthy estate. And she grew up maybe in a somewhat idyllic, natural environment. It was only when she became a little bit older as a child that people began to imagine that she could only possibly live in this very wealthy, as a person of color, she could only live in this wealthy area if she worked there. And she started to realize that she was being regarded differently simply because of her color. Her parents, she said, knew and loved that land more than anyone, even including the owners, but they didn't have title to that land, and when they lost that job, they had to leave it. That, I think, is a grounding in the kind of work that Carolyn Finney has gone on to do. She says you can love a place as you can love a person. So she's gone on to do this research in conceptions of place and attitudes to nature. We're very excited about her forthcoming book. Her first book is coming out in May. It's called Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. Please help me welcome Carolyn Finney.
I know, that's right, improvisational dance. I probably need to do something magical here, but I'm not sure what that is. Station. We pause for a moment for station identification.
To the right.
Oh, thank you. I can't see either. All right, so then I just, thank you. Okay. Oh, so I don't have to make this big? I just have to do it. Oh, sorry. Huh. Is the right plug-in? I swore that I was going to, oh, there we go, it's there.
Oh, it's there. Okay,
it's
so
there, just needed time. I just pressed that one, thank you. All right. Good afternoon. I know we've all been sitting for a little while, so I hope I can hold your attention for just a little while longer. First, I want to thank Charles and Carly and Kathleen, I know who's around here somewhere, and everyone else in Oregon for inviting me here. This is my first time at Oregon State, first time in Corvallis, so it's kind of interesting. It's raining, I expected that. It's a good thing. I also want to thank my fellow speakers today. I kind of think of all of what it is that we're sharing with you. We're in conversation with each other about the different ways to think about what's happening with the environment, about the relationships between people and the environment, and also about, they're saying something to me anyway, about the relationships of people to each other in spite of our differences. So I kind of want to start there a little bit. The other thing I just have to say, because it's kind of obvious, but this is me, and so I always have to say it. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some stories that I wrote in my book about African Americans and the environment. And the obvious thing is I'm African American, right? So I always have to call that out, even though it's kind of obvious. Because for me, this isn't just something I talk about, it's also something that I live and experience on a daily basis. The other thing is that I want to ask you to sort of transcend that boundary of difference for the time that I'm talking, the idea that I'm talking about black people, so this doesn't really have anything to do with me necessarily, it's just a nice story. And actually, what happens when we transcend the boundary, remember, our humanity, and actually that there's something there. How do we see differently? You know, for me, this conference, this symposium, in the title, you know, for me, it's about transformation. And I know oftentimes we're looking forward and elsewhere about how we do something different, and sometimes it's always been in front of us all along. And all we have to do is actually see differently. So what I'm kind of asking you to do for this little amount of time is sort of see differently. So I got to share with you, this is kind of, I'm in love with this guy right now. Have you heard about this guy? So I watched 60 Minutes. He's 16 years old, okay? A Jack and Drake guy. I watched 60 Minutes last week, and I just thought, man, this guy, he's so wise, and he's like 16 years old. So a year ago, when he was 15 years old, he got an idea in fifth grade. He was in fifth grade biology. He couldn't have been. Fifth period biology. And he was a freshman in high school. He's 15. And a family friend had recently died from pancreatic cancer. And during fifth period biology, when he should have been paying attention to the teacher, but thankfully he was not, because he was reading some other articles, he got this idea about a potential test that could be done. If it could be done early on with pancreatic cancer, a lot of lives could be saved. And I guess pancreatic cancer is a really hard cancer to diagnose, which is why so many people lose their lives to it. So he wrote up a proposal, a protocol, he put it together, he sent it out to 200 labs and PhDs and important people around the country. 199 refused to take him seriously. One took him seriously in Johns Hopkins, and gave him a space in their lab, and so that they're working on this idea that a 15-year-old got during fifth period biology in ninth grade. I want to make sure I get my facts right. He won the Intel International Science Award, which is $100,000. That's him winning, okay? If you get a chance, you have to watch the video. I cry every time I see it because just the joy that he feels in winning that and the surprise and the humility that he won this for this idea. But the thing that really stuck in my mind and sticks in my mind about him for the last week is that when Morally Safer on 60 Minutes commented on how smart Jack was, Jack replied, quote, "I don't think it's that I'm really smart. I mean, I know people who are way smarter than me. You can be a genius, but if you don't have the creativity to put that knowledge to use, then you just have a bunch of knowledge and nothing else." And I was floored. I was like, he's 15! That's it. You know, for me, you just have a bunch of knowledge. It's about the creativity. And so I want us to keep that in mind as well. So I have other people that, I have a lot of people, you know, I feel like there's a lot of people out there in the world that sort of influence, you know, how we think and how we feel and how inspired we are. And recently, within the last year or two, there's a number of people I've heard speak, so I want to share a little bit about why they inspire me for today. The first person I wanted to talk about is Nikki Giovanni, who's the black and white picture up here. A lot of you may she's a well-known poet, has won tons and tons of awards for her work. And back in the fall, I heard her speak. She was in Oakland, California. And one of the things that stuck in my mind, somebody in the audience, we had a question and answer period, and somebody in the audience said, you know, so in terms of the African diaspora, you know, is it really important for us to learn and understand African languages in order to really get a grasp? And she kind of thought about it for a second, and I think she was kind of like, well, you could learn language, you could not learn language. But it wasn't simply about language as we understand it on a piece of paper. She talked about the need to know different literacies. She reminded us of the way in which sailors can read the stars, farmers can read the land, scientists can read DNA in a particular way, that we can be multilingual, but beyond the way we actually tend to think of language, at least here in the United States, the idea that we think about different literacies, which I think about a lot. I've also got this picture of, and some of us older folks may know who this is, Jackie Moms Mabley. Jackie Moms Mabley was a black comedian. She came out of vaudeville. She was a black comedian in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I remember when I was growing up, for me and my family anyway, seeing this black comedian on TV was a big deal. So she'd do this thing, right? When she put on her costume, she'd take out her teeth. She'd put on this schmata. She'd wear this. I'm originally from New York. Put on this hat with a flower in it, and she'd come on stage and talk. She commanded huge audiences of predominantly white individuals. And this is where she'd talk about everything. She'd talk about race. Now, in the 50s and 60s, this was really risque to come on stage and do that. But she did it, and she'd get away with it. Audiences loved her. She was friends with the president, President Kennedy at the time. She'd get invited to the White House, just like that. There's a recent documentary that's on HBO about her that Whoopi Goldberg put together, and Arsenio Hall, a black talk show host, was interviewed, and he talked about how she was able to sneak it through the back door. These really important topics at the time that had to do with civil rights, and she'd come right out and say it. And she was able to do it because she kind of snuck it in the back door. She used humor to get at that truth. And so I think a lot about sneaking it through the back door, and people that are, some of the people I'm going to tell you about today that I feel like are sneaking it through the back door, and some are walking actually right through the front door. But sometimes you have to sneak it through the back door to get what it is you want people to understand. And finally, the one other person I have up here is Bernice Reagan Johnson. You may not have heard of her, but her group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, many of you may have heard of. She was one of the original founders. She's got her PhD. She worked at the Smithsonian for a lot of years. And I had an opportunity about a year and a half or 2 years ago at the University of Minnesota. There was a conference called Black Environmental Thought 2. And I was like, oh, that was exciting. I didn't know there was a Black Environmental Thought 1, so it was really exciting to go to the second one. And she was the keynote speaker. And she came up and she said, this is the first time somebody's asked me to come talk about the environment. But for her, she had to really think about that. And she sort of brought her song and her way of thinking. But the thing that stuck out for me, a lot of things stuck out for me that she said, but the one that I want to share with you today is how she talked about the need to, quote, go below the intellectual paper record to get those black stories. So she was talking in an academic setting, much like this one, and there were a lot of folks, students and professors and others who had formal degrees who were sitting in the audience, and she said, you're not going to find our stories in the library, for the most part. So actually, we have to go below the paper record. And so in my working on the book, I really understood that. I understood that personally, but I also understood that I would be frustrated that I'm not finding stories about African Americans and the environment broadly defined in the library, but that's not because the stories didn't exist. And so I believe we have to look everywhere. We have to look at travel memoirs, autobiographies, letters written back and forth, art, music, all the spaces within which black people have been working to produce knowledge, because oftentimes throughout history, we have not been allowed in the more formal spaces of knowledge production. And I think that's true for a lot of groups, not just African Americans. So, black faces, white spaces, reimagining the relationship of African Americans to the great outdoors. It used to be a shorter title, but my publisher wanted me to make it a little bit longer. This was a dissertation for me first, and then it became a book. I was primarily motivated to do this. I was primarily motivated to do this, and partially because of the way Charles introduced me, because it was personal. I actually believe, for me, that it's always personal. I think we can make a choice to leave the personal out, but because I also believe all knowledge is subjective, and that we bring all of who we are to bear up on anything that we're trying to understand. I just like to be really in your face about it. So it's really important for me to tell you a little bit about my background, where I grew up. So I was born in Manhattan, in New York City. I've lived in a lot of places, and it's so funny when people always ask me, where are you from? And I said, do you want to know where I live or where I'm from? And then some people say, you must be from New York. I said, I'm from New York, that's right. So I was born in Manhattan. My parents, like a lot of African Americans during the 50s were part of that great migration from the South. My parents grew up together in a small town in Virginia, Floyd, Virginia. They have a high school education. They grew up, you know, Oprah says there's poor and there's po. My parents, I think, were in the po place. My father went to the Korean War. When he came back from the Korean War, he couldn't get a job, and he said, let's go north. He got two options when he got to New York. He could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of New York City, or he had this opportunity to be a caretaker on this very wealthy estate. It's a wealthy family, a wealthy Jewish family called the Clintons in New York. They have their own building. I believe it's on Madison Avenue. And they own a lot of property in New York City. So it's a beautiful 12-acre estate. This is just a couple of pictures of it. It has a pond with fish and snapping turtles. There's gardens. There's what I call the big house. This is where the Tishmans come for the weekends and holidays. And that, which you can't see very well, which is the gardener's cottage, which is where my parents lived. My father was the chauffeur, the gardener, the caretaker. My mom was the housekeeper for some of that time. They wanted to have kids. They thought they couldn't have any, so they adopted me. And then what I always like to say, and then they relaxed. So now I have two brothers. During the week, it was like living in your own private park because the owners generally weren't there during the week. What's interesting about this neighborhood, I don't know how many of you remember Schaefer beer. Schaefer lived next door. Harry Winston had property down the street. The kind of money, this was a very wealthy white neighborhood. There's no other way to say it, a very wealthy white neighborhood. Wingfoot Golf Club is walking distance around the corner, and Scarsdale is right down the road. We were the only family of color in that neighborhood until the 90s. That's when a Japanese-American woman moved in. She's since moved out. I think that, you know, one of the things that I loved about living here, and it's something that, Charles, that you said, is that sort of there was something idyllic in terms of the beauty of this place. I mean, it was old school, man. We played outside. I can still remember making the driveway the Piranha River. I mean, I have all those stories of the ways in which my brothers and I engaged in the landscape. I also remember being 9 years old, and there was always police patrolling the neighborhood because you have a lot of money in this neighborhood, right? And I remember walking home one day. I was very unimpressive looking. I had a little afro, a little reading glasses, my school bag. And I was around the corner from the house, and a cop stopped me, and he wanted to know where I was going, and I gave him the address. And he said, oh, do you work there? I'm like, I'm 9. I didn't say that, but I got confused about that. And I remember going home and telling my father, who believes he's the most radical black man in America, so he immediately called the police station and gave him a holy hell. And cops never stopped me or my brothers again. But what that did for me, I think, at that moment is really bring to attention how me and my family didn't belong there. The fact that we could say we worked there made it kind of okay, but actually being in this place of beautiful yards, nice trees, beautiful woods, actually wasn't a place for us. We also lived, all these houses were on top of a hill in the Mamaroneck, like in a lot of places. So all the big houses and big yards are at the top of the hill, but if you go down the hill, which takes you maybe 5 or 10 minutes on your bike, you hit the village and the town where you had a lot of working class folks, Italian Americans, other black Americans as well, and so you had a very different vibe. I went to school with a lot of these kids, which is another story altogether, which I don't have time for. But the other thing that I want to say about this is that in the late 90s, Mr. Tishman had died a lot of years ago. Yeah, I still call him Mr. and Mrs. Tishman. That's another thing, but for another time. Mrs. Tishman was dying, knew that she was dying in the 90s, and the question was, what happens to my parents, right? They've been on this land all that time. And I have to give her credit because she really wanted to keep my parents on that land. I mean, she had my father at her bedside when she died. She had a very close relationship with my father, a very conflicted and complex relationship, I should say. And at the end of the day, her grown children said, no, you know, that's not going to work. We can't separate up the property. It's not going to happen. So she said she would have a house built for them where they would like. My parents tried to stay in New York. To stay in that neighborhood, the property taxes alone on that land at that time were $125,000 a year. My father was making about $20,000 a year. So there was no way my parents could have ever afforded it anyway. So my father swore they were never moving back to Virginia. So, of course, that's where they had their house built. They're now living in Leesburg, Virginia, where my youngest brother is there because he's married and has kids, and I move around too much, as does my other brother. So my parents are back in Virginia. They've been there full-time, I guess, probably since about 2003. And my parents, in particular, my dad, have been extremely depressed after leaving New York and this land. They were on this land for 50 years. For 50 years, I believe, they knew this land better than the owners did. They had to. They had to understand what happens when all that scum gets on the pond and it has to be cleaned up. And excuse the expression, but when all that bird shit is there, my father has to clean it up. Or what does it mean when certain trees are dying and have to be cut down? My mother would talk about the wildlife on the property as though she had personal relationships with them. And at the end of the day, that doesn't count for ownership. That knowledge, that commitment, that blood, that sweat, that love that we don't often talk about in academic circles, but let's get real for just a moment. And it doesn't actually count that much. A couple of years ago, my parents got a letter from one of the neighbors, because the neighbors like to say when something's happening on the land to let them know. There's a new owner there, a very wealthy man as well. And the owner, the letter was from it was from a conservancy group in Westchester that had put a conservation easement on the property. The new owner had said, yes, please put a conservation easement on this property. So they were thanking the new owner in the letter. They were talking about all the positive environmental qualities that this piece of property had, everything from where it sat in relationship to the rest of the watershed, all the wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. And as I read this letter, it wasn't very long, I thought, where is the thank you to the people who cared for that land for 50 years? And then I started thinking about all the people in the history of this country and beyond who have become invisible in that larger conversation. And when we talk about the environment and environmental movement and who actually cares and who's got ideas and who's put in their time and who's giving up their life, who are we talking about? So it's our first speaker who introduced us to this to ask, who is the we here? And who's being left out of the we? And so very much personally driven, it was partially a love letter to my parents, actually, to do this work. And then I realized as I started meeting just amazing African Americans around the country that it was a larger love letter to African Americans. And then actually, as I kept thinking about it, I said, actually, to all of us, and to myself as well. Yeah. Move on, Mom and Dad. Oh, so, this is always challenging for me. So I want to preface this by saying my interest is I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, feel guilty. You're going to feel what you're going to feel, and I can't control that as much as I might try. What I'm trying to do here is kind of set a context to understand then when I tell you the stories of resilience, the stories that I like to call the in spite of stories, where that creative imagination comes from. The ideas come from. The outside of the box, where they come from. I think that we have to take a little brief stroll just down history for just a minute to stand in it, because that's what's real for many of us. There's a legacy for that. We can call it history. For me, I call it, it's here right now. It's always here. When I walk around, it's in my skin all the time in many ways. And so I'm going to ask you all to engage with that for a second. So in the book, I do a couple of things, and I'll just really quickly, because I want to get to the really powerful stories of people that I know. I give a little bit of a history lesson from a different perspective, because I kind of talk about things like slavery and the Homestead Act and how Gifford Pinchot and John Muir and all these things were happening at the same time. But as it had to do with black people, you wouldn't know that in terms of opportunities for European immigrants to get a hold of land that, of course, was removed, where Native Americans had to be removed from. And what happens when we have all this complexity in the story is messy. Sometimes the story is ugly. And I think the story is real. And so I talk about that a little bit. I also talk about the power of individual and collective memory, and that's why I put this up here. For African Americans in particular, to both motivate, to inform, to build relationship, and for many reasons, partly coming to distrust historically the government for a myriad of reasons, everything from the Tuskegee experiments to slavery. We could go on and on about that. One personal story that I like to tell, that when a few years back when I was writing up my dissertation, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I got my parents to come down and visit me, which was a feat unto itself to get them to come visit me. And I said, we're going to go to Martin Luther King National Park. And, my father was he's always not that interested. I said, come on, we're just going to go. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to go. Martin Luther King National Park, unlike Yosemite or Yellowstone, is actually right in the middle of the city. People live on the streets. This park is an active park with people in it. It has Martin Luther King's house, where he grew up in, Ebenezer Baptist Church. And there's a visitor center on there. And in the visitor center, you can go in, and there was all these dioramas. And it's supposed to kind of give you that feeling of what it must have been like during Dr. King's time. There's replicas of images and full sized people and protests and all these things going on. And over the speaker, you kind of hear his voice. And there's even a replica of a jail cell there. So you really get the feeling. My father, who I think of as a very stoic man, who his emotion that he's most comfortable with is angry. But he doesn't really do anything. As we were standing, him and I, together, and we're looking at one of these dioramas, and he suddenly grabs my arm, and that's just not something he does. And he looked really nervous and uncomfortable, and then he laughed nervously. What I thought had happened was that he was having a heart attack. Because I'd never seen him grab me like he needed help. You know, I was like, what's going on here? And I said, are you okay? And he said, you know, I looked up, and I saw that image of the whites only sign, and for a second, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. He had flashed back that fast for what, 40 years ago? Something came back. I got so upset. I had to like try to be cool and calm, but I was like so upset by that something, you know, and someone so strong had made him so vulnerable in that instant, and that memory had flashed back. And these are a lot of the stories, particularly from older African Americans, that I have heard when talking to them about those memories. And those memories don't go away. You know, they kind of linger because they kind of inform how you think about yourself. And in spaces, and outdoor spaces aren't immune to that. Doesn't mean that you feel differently about outdoor spaces. It's complex about what it means to go by yourself into any of these spaces that you weren't allowed to go in for a very long time. I serve on the National Parks Advisory Board, which I'm very privileged to do. And when I told my father that, my father told me when he came back for the Korean War that he thought he'd like to get a job at a park because it would be a good government job, but he was told in the South that they don't hire Negroes. And so just that sort of distance of time that I could actually be sitting on the board where he felt he couldn't get a job, and how that stayed with him over time. So I talk about memory. I also talk about in the book the issue of representation, you know, images. Stories. And it's really interesting to me about images because we often think of images as being kind of benign, but I'm here to say to you they are not. They are quite powerful. People sat down, they made a decision what images they were going to show and what images they're not going to show. And when you think about that in relationship to nature and the environment as we generally define it, what does that mean? Who do we see? A few years ago, Vanity Fair came out with their first green issue. On the cover, you can see you've got George Clooney, you've got Senator Kennedy, you've got Julia Roberts, you've got Al Gore. In there, you have 63 pages of people talking about all the good things they're doing for the environment. Some of these were art organizations, some of these were individuals, and it's great, actually. They were talking about all the things they were doing. In 63 pages of pictures of people and stories, there were 2 people of color. One of them was Wangari Maathai, because she had just won the Nobel Prize for her work in Kenya. I had a problem with that. I said, so what are you telling me? So the only people that really have good ideas about the environment are predominantly white, Canadian, American, and European. That's all right. The only African they had was Wangari Maathai. There was nobody from Asia, and there was nobody from South America. And I really want to question that because actually for me this is something I feel like I see over and over again. I started to do a lot of counting in other magazines like Outside and others to really see over a long period of time who are we seeing in relationship to the environment. And when we do see African Americans, are we seeing a man, woman, or child? What is the context? Most of the time I found it's largely urban. It's as though we only exist in urban areas. We don't have any deeper or more complex relationship with the environment. The last thing that I want to say that I look at before I get onto the stories in the book is, I just kind of call it out again and talk about racism and diversity. I was able to talk to a lot of people, black and white, who work in environmental organizations across this country, including the National Park Service. Because for me, if you don't talk about it, you can't change it. So we got to start talking about what's there. And it was such a chasm between many of the white colleagues and black colleagues in there on those who perceived that racism was actually taking place and how they defined it, and others who even came around and would ask me, are you crazy? What are you talking about? And for me, that just pointed to the need to have a bigger conversation about what that is and how that exists, particularly in agencies like the National Park Service. A personal story that I want to give about that, too, is that a number of years ago, there's a place in New York called the Garrison Institute, which is kind of a spiritual place on the Hudson River that allows people to come in who want to talk about spirituality and environmental issues. It's quite a beautiful place. It used to be a monastery there. And there was a 2 or 3 day symposium going on. It was about how can we make the environmental movement more progressive. and kind of tap into what's progressive about that. And so they called together some really amazing leaders, academic leaders, people running major environmental organizations that you'd recognize from around the country, as well as Buddhist practitioners. At the last minute, a friend of mine who was from the Park Service called me and said, "Oh my God, Carolyn, would you want to come?" I was a grad student. I was like, "Yeah, this is cool." I was like, "This will be like research. I'll definitely come." I got there, and on the first night, there were about 40 of us who were invited because it was by invitation only. There was a big circle in a room. There was a big gold Buddha in the background. And as I looked around the circle, I was the only person of color. Not the only black person, the only person of color in the room of 40. And I was like, this is going to be a long 3 days. And I got nervous. And as everybody had to introduce themselves, somehow I ended up near the end. And I was like, oh man. I was just, by the time it got to me, I was like, what? The elephant in the room here is so obvious. But I kind of skirted around it. I said I made a little reference to it, and then I kind of left it alone. Because I was also a student, and so I just didn't feel like I had a lot of power in the room. So then we all broke up and we said, okay, we're going to determine what are going to be the best topics that we should be pursuing over the course of the next 2 days. And somebody said, we need to talk about racism and homophobia and all that feminism and blah, 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 blah. Carolyn, why don't you run that group? I said, okay, I'll do it. Over the course of the next 2 days, that was the only group I was allowed to run. So when I wanted to go into a conversation about soil and soul, I couldn't go because I was expected to run the one on racism, homophobia, feminism, and everything. And you know, I'll just say, I was probably the last one who actually needed to be in the group talking about it for 3 days. By the third day, I lost it. I lost it in the room. I said, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to become an angry black woman. And there was a moment they said, okay, we've narrowed it down. What groups are still important? Who thinks the feminism, racism, homophobia group is still important? One person came over and sat down next to me and no one else, and this older man came over to me and he said, you know, listen, honey, why don't you just come in with our group here in communication? And that's when I lost it. And they saw me lose it, and it became a thing, and my friends took me out the side room. I just got very emotional because I said, this is the problem. And then after about a half an hour, I came back and I said, I want to address the group because I'm almost as responsible too for not saying anything. And the minute I just called it out in the room, then people started raising their hand and going, I knew it. I saw this was happening, but I didn't want to deal with it. I'm too tired to deal with it. I tried to ignore it. And then I made grown men cry. That was a highlight moment for me. It's not that I like making people cry, but I could see that they were moved. I was crying, so, you know, join me. And then we had a real conversation about that. But this, for me, is one of those stereotypes that goes on and on. I'm often the only one in the group, particularly when it has to do with environmental issues. So for me, this isn't in the past. This goes on all the time about assumptions made about who I am and what I know and how I can participate and how I'm going to feel. People kind of forget I bleed like everybody else. And I've got, you know, I'm complex like everybody else. And so saying all of that, I kind of want to bring you to some stories of people I met. Oh, almost, actually. I have to say one more thing about this, and then I can get on to the really good stories. So, you know, when you do a book in an academic setting, you have reviewers read it, and one reviewer, and I happen to know who he was, he said, you know, you need to talk more about fear, why African Americans are afraid. I'd like you to spend a whole chapter talking about why African Americans are afraid. Now, throughout the book, I mention things about the lynching, the woods. I bring in little bits that fear is real and exists. But I was really troubled by the idea that I don't actually want to give a whole chapter talking about why we're afraid, because we're going to get stuck in that. We're not simply victims, and we're not simply afraid. So I struggled over that for a while, and then decided that I'm going to use the fear as a jumping off point to talk about resilience. Again, the in spite of all of that, to be afraid of. But I need to read for you a paragraph that I use in the book. It's a woman named Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary who wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she encapsulated it so quickly that the context to understand that fear and then to understand why the in spite of is so powerful. So bear with me for about a minute. 180 years of the Middle Passage. 246 years of slavery, rape, and abuse. 100 years of illusory freedom. Black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, all codified by our national institutions. Lynching, medical experimentation, redlining, disenfranchisement, grossly unequal treatment in almost every aspect of our society, brutality at the hands of those charged with protecting and serving. being undesirable strangers in the only land we know. During the 385 years since the first of our ancestors were brought here against their will, we have barely had time to catch our collective breath. That we are here at all can be seen as a testament to our willpower, spiritual strength, and resilience. So now I'm going to tell you some good stories. Maveen Betch. Has anybody heard of Maveen? Maveen Betch. Because you're going to hear of her now. Maveen Betch was born in on Amelia Island, which is off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. She was born in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s. Her great-grandfather, A.L. Lewis, was the first man, black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville. Because he was the first, he made a whole lot of money. In the 30s and 40s and 50s, black people couldn't go to the same beach as white people could go to. So A.L. Lewis decided what he was going to do was buy a beach. And he was going to buy a beach on Amelia Island, and he called that beach, ironically, American Beach. So he bought this strip of beach, which still exists here. These are some of the sand dunes in this picture. And on that beach, judges could live next door to janitors. So black judges, black janitors could actually own a home, a modest home on the beach. Families could come play, children could come play, which they did all the time. And Maveen was one of those children. Maveen got her education at Oberlin College. Her sister is Jonetta Cole, which is more well-known. She's a well-known black anthropologist who heads up the Smithsonian right now, the African American Museum. She got her degree at Oberlin College. She decided she wanted to be an opera singer. She went to Germany. She had some success there. But sometime in the 70s, she decided she wanted to come home, and she got very interested in environmental causes. First, she was interested in international causes. She helped sponsor a guy who was studying the monarch butterfly. She was interested in the pygmies in Africa. She came home and gave away all her wealth to environmental causes, over $750,000. When I say she gave it all away, she gave the house away. She lived on the beach and on a chaise lounge for a while. Jonetta found that out and bought her a trailer, which she then turned into a little museum. So if you showed up, she would open it up to you because she collected all this information about the environment that she wanted to share with you. As she was home, she realized something was happening at American Beach. It's a fine strip of beachfront property. Developers were salivating. There was already Fernandina Beach, which was also on the island, and another resort, ironically, called Amelia Island Plantation. Yes. Where there were golf courses and people could come and have a more designed, natural experience in the environment. I have my own biases, I admit it. So developers wanted to buy up American Beach, and Maveen decided that she was going to fight that. Because for her, it wasn't just about protecting the maritime forest. It wasn't just about protecting and the beach itself in terms of the sand and beachfront erosion. It was also about protecting the African-American history in that place, and the two things were woven very tightly together. And so she worked tirelessly to bring attention to what was going on here. She finally got the National Park Service to put part of these sand dunes under their own protection. One of the stories she would tell me is, she says, I'd go to civic meetings. She goes, I stand in the back of the room. Now, it's really hard to miss. She's completely majestic. What she's holding there is all her hair. It's all her dreadlocks were so long, right? She'd wrap them up around there. She'd stand in the back of the room. She says, and they do the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'd be like, I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it would stand, one nation, under God, indivisible. And then she shouted at the top of her lungs, for all white people who got money. And she'd get everybody's attention. And so sometimes people just would be like, oh my God, it's Maveen. And others, of course, were really happy to have her there. She became known as the Beach Lady. So if you're look her up online, that's how you can find her. There's been a book written about her, a film made at Sundance Film Festival about her life. She died a couple of months after Katrina hit. She had been dealing with stomach cancer for some time. One of the last things that Maveen told me was, she said, I am the freest person you will ever meet. Because for her, by giving away all her money, it freed her up to do exactly what she wanted to do, exactly in the way she needed to do it. And nobody in this room had heard about Maveen, right? So I would think about representation. Another fabulous person. How many of you have heard of John Francis? Ooh, we got a couple. Yeah, I'm feeling good. So John Francis is another amazing person that I've had the privilege to know. John Francis grew up in the Bay Area. He talked about in the 70s there was a small oil spill there at the time. He got really upset by that oil spill, so he decided he wasn't going to be taking any trucks or cars or buses, and he said he'd walk around to everything he needed. Neighbors and friends were always trying to pick him up in their trucks and cars, and he'd always say no, and then they'd get into an argument. That got really tiring for him, so he decided he was going to stop talking about it. And then he decided he was going to stop talking. So for 22 years, John Francis walked across the United States and South America to raise awareness about the environment. He did it for 17 years without talking. He got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin without talking. Okay, yes, that's correct. I don't even know how you did that, what he talked about. He said he started talking on the day of his dissertation defense, which happened to be Earth Day. Then for a while, he was talking again, but he still was not taking any other kinds of transport except for walking or a bicycle. And he was working on a friend's boat somewhere in New England. He got a call from Washington, D.C. Exxon Valdez had just happened. He was the only PhD at that time in the United States who had done a PhD on oil spills. So they wanted him to come down and talk about, putting together some kind of oil spill policy. They wanted to interview him for this job. He was like, great, I'd love to come down. They said, okay, we'll send you a plane ticket. He's like, I don't take a plane. I said, we'll send you a train ticket, I don't take the train. We'll send you a bus ticket, I don't take the bus. They're like, how are you going to get here? He said, I'll ride my bike. And they were like, how long is it going to take you? About a month. They waited for him, he went, he interviewed, he got the job. Since then, John has an organization called Planet Walk. A couple of years ago, he took a group of people to Cuba where he set up a satellite system so that school kids in Cuba could communicate with school kids here about their environmental concerns and interests and experiences. Planet Walk, when he first self-published the book a few years ago, National Geographic has since picked it up. Hollywood has bought the rights to the story and are looking at making a mainstream movie about a black man who walks across the United States and South America to raise awareness about the environment. Now, some people say to me, oh, Hollywood always makes a mess of shit. And I said, listen, it's a story about a black man walking across the United States to raise awareness about the environment. How many of those movies have you seen? And if they put Will Smith or Chiwetel Ejiofor or any of those really well-known people which they're talking to in that, you're going to get a lot of people in the movie theater who are going to be blown away by seeing this man talking about those issues in the way that he talks about them. And I think that's quite powerful by any means necessary. I want to talk a little bit about Brenda Palm's Barber. Talk about out-of-the-box ideas. Brenda Palm's Barber runs a business called Sweet Beginnings. I met Brenda a couple of years ago. I was in Chicago, and she was giving a talk at the Science Museum there. I was actually there to see Majora Carter, who's also quite fabulous and kind of well-known for the work she's done in the South Bronx in New York. And then Brenda Palm's Barber comes on. Brenda Palm's Barber got a business degree. She's from Denver. She got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, listen, can you come here and come up with an idea for jobs? We've got a significant number of previously incarcerated black men and women who come out of jail and can't get a job. If you can think of something. And she said, okay, I'll do it. I come there. She said, she created with another group of people this idea, this sort of framework called U-turn. The idea that we can always make a U-turn in our lives if we've made a mistake. But she couldn't come up with what's the thing that they're going to do? What's the task? What's the job? She thought maybe gardening or driving the elderly around, but none of these jobs seemed to have any kind of longevity. And then a friend started talking to her about bees. And she thought, that's it. I'm going to train them to make urban honey, and we're going to sell it in Chicago. And a lot of people thought she was crazy. Previously incarcerated black men and women are going to make urban honey in Chicago. Okay. The business is called Sweet Beginnings. They make urban honey and honey-related products. She started out by selling it as kind of Whole Foods and those high-end stores in the Chicago area. You can buy it online. The stuff, it's gone. She can't keep up with the amount of business. The powerful thing is, she said, is that she knew nothing about what it meant to be a green business. She had no idea. After a year, she found that she was already running a green business. She was doing it instinctually. She never thought of herself as an environmentalist or green. They weren't feeding their bees sugar derivatives. There were all these things that they were doing. It was local. She also talked about how they hired beekeepers who came in, who trained everyone. She can tell you everything about the life cycle of the honeybee and the understanding that if the honeybee dies, we're soon to follow right after that. And everybody who works for her knows that as well. She talks about interviewing some of these previously incarcerated black men and women. She says, you know, they'll sit in front of me, they'll tell me their name, and I'll say, so you went to jail? They're like, yeah. And she goes, so what'd you go to jail for? And they'll say something like selling drugs. And she'll pause for a moment, she said, and then she'll say, were you good at it? And she says, usually they say, yeah, until I got caught. And she goes, well, what were you good at? And they'll say, well, I knew the value of my product, I knew my customer base, and everything they spelled out were skills she saw as being transferable. So suddenly these people were coming to table with something. You know, because we often actually ignore those people altogether, so they don't have any knowledge or experience or anything to offer. But suddenly she was reminding them, oh, you've got a whole set of skills. We just got to transfer them over here, get creative about that. The incarceration, the recidivism rate in this country is really high. Men and women who go to jail usually go back. The recidivism rate in her organization is very, very low. I saw a talk a couple of years ago where one of these young men got up in front of them, and he was in this suit, and he looked kind of uncomfortable, like the suit was too big. And he just stood in front of the microphone with his head down. He said, I never knew green could be so good to me. And he meant it at a really deep level. I'm still moved when I think about that. For me, this is really out-of-the-box thinking, you know, this idea. If you go there, it's a 3-story house. They have a little over 25 apiaries in the backyard. The lotions and everything are made off-site somewhere else. There's a crack house on one part of the street. There's working girls on the corner. They're working right where they live and where they are. And there's something very real and powerful about that. How am I doing, man? I'm done? Okay. Then I'm going to skip it. There's more stories, Paul Fryer. You can ask me about that in questions. And you can ask me about Tyree Guyton as well, Detroit. So the last thing I just want to say then is, does anybody know what that is? Did anybody see this story about the Icelandic elves? Okay. This story, I love these kind of stories. So I put up this is the elf door in Iceland. I probably saw this about a month ago in the news, I think, in the Associated Press. In Iceland right now, you have environmentalists working together with people who believe there are elves in Iceland on the landscape. There's a road project that is threatened to be built through this particular piece of landscape. So in terms of the ecology of the landscape, it would be detrimentally affected, but people say it's also about the culture, about these elves. And it's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court in Iceland. Right? And I found it so incredibly powerful about the way many of them, historians, they even talked to Björk, who's the well-known singer from Iceland, about the way within which elves and nature are linked for them, and their belief in it, that it's going as far as the highest court in their country, that they take it so seriously. And there's something about magic, mystery, and the I don't know there that is quite powerful and engaging that, and which is where I think we have to be right now with that as well. Okay. And yeah, I guess, you know, Bill Clinton came to Berkeley a couple of years ago and gave a talk, and politics aside about where you stand about university, one of the things that he said that was really powerful to me, he said, you know, what developing countries need is infrastructure and resources. He said, in the United States, our problem is the rigidity of our institutions. And I thought that was so powerful because the way within which we set our rules, our boundaries, this is how you do things, our disciplines, this is how you come to know, this is what counts as knowledge, this is what's valued. And I think of all the things we don't see because of the rigidity there. And so what I'm putting forth today is that we get rid of some of those boundaries, we transcend some of those boundaries. There's people out there who know an awful lot, who have great ideas, who have been doing it all along, who've had to be resilient. They've been here. They've been in the hot spot their entire lives. And that we should be sitting down with them, having that conversation, building those relationships, because for me, that's where a lot of the possibility lies. Thank you.